Potential is the one thing that should terrify you. If you suck, then whatever, lots of people suck. But only one person can live up to your potential. It's one of the few things that is both carrot and stick. You're compelled to chase it because we all wonder what the top end of that potential is, yet you're also held hostage to it, never really knowing whether you've achieved it. The sick joke of this carrot and stick game being that those who chase the hardest will often, in the long run, undermine that potential. This is the story of Ruri Dragon, her reclusive artist, and the industry that nearly killed them both. Manga is an $11 billion industry in Japan, so it's easy to see why young artists would dedicate themselves to getting a slice of that pie. Pay for a mangaka is also generally better than that of animators, as, unlike in anime, the artists have the ability to make royalties off of their work. One hit with a dedicated fan base and an artist can keep cranking out the stories and effectively secure a lifetime bag. Aspiring mangaka tend to start off running one-shots. A one-shot is exactly what it sounds like, one self-contained story within a world of the author's creation. Generally speaking, these are used to add variety to a magazine, and if one of them takes off, the magazine will pick it up as a regular manga. Dragon Ball, Bleach, Naruto, Berserk, Death Note, One Piece, they all started off as one-shots. Even if you've never read a manga in your entire life, you've definitely heard of at least one of these shows. And just for reference of the scale we're talking about here, Oda, the original creator of One Piece, is estimated to be worth around $200 million. Almost entirely from One Piece and One Piece merchandise. Dedicated manga readers will also notice of the series I named, all of them came out of Shonen Jump. Shonen Jump is a weekly anthology of manga that's been running since 1968, and in that time has sold 7.5 billion copies. This is, to use a business term, a fucking lot. Without diving into the wacky world of Japanese media conglomerates, the big takeaways are this. Shonen Jump is owned by a company called Sashuya. They are direct competitors with Kondasha and Shogakukan, and Sashuya, with Shonen Jump, kicks the living crap out of everybody else in terms of sales and market cap. For an up-and-coming mangaka, getting onto one of these companies' platforms would be a huge boon for their career, just through the exposure alone. And that's ignoring the money that you make publishing the manga, or selling the merch, and the boost to any later projects that the artist picks up. The short version is that it is a big deal to get into one of these magazines. And of course, there are lots of small-time weekly magazines, but none of them even come close to the dominance of Shonen Jump. And you might be able to tell from the name that this anthology almost entirely focuses on shonen manga, or manga intended for a younger male audience. That's not to say they never publish anything else, but generally speaking, a manga would have to be something pretty special to end up in Shonen Jump without being shonen. And that's exactly what Ruri Dragon did. Before we get into the tragic story of Ruri, though, we should probably know what it is. Ruri Dragon is the story of a high school freshman named Ruri, who, as you might have guessed, is a dragon. Or, well, half dragon. A really interesting part of this world is how banal this fact is to everyone. Every adult in the story treats the idea of a half-dragon person as just run-of-the-mill. Whether that be the teacher, who could care less as long as Ruri is okay, or her mom, who just sort of drops it on her daughter that she's half-dragon after she grows horns and starts breathing fire. Without spoiling the little story there is, what I can say is that what Ruri Dragon does best is treating the characters and the readers as adults. Something that's always kept me from getting into most slice-of-life manga is how overtly cliché most of the characters are. Ruri doesn't lean on quite so a cliché structure for the story, and is seemed to be set up for a pretty innovative coming-of-age story. I wouldn't put it on the same tier as, say, Pun Pun, but I'll openly admit I'm heavily biased towards Pun Pun, but maybe a more mainstream, accessible, less depressing version of that story. And if you've not read it, now is a great time to go and pick it up, because there's literally only 5 chapters out, and it doesn't look like that's going to change for quite a while. But what about the business side?
Open the sack first and see what's actually in it. It might not even be worth the trouble.
Hi. Okay, it's worth it.
In its first week as a serialized manga, Ruri Dragon got a full cover placement in Shonen Jump, which should tell you something about how confident the higher-ups were in this IP. And it seems their confidence was well placed, because within its first week, Ruri Dragon sold over 78,000 copies. And I know, without context, it's hard to make heads or tails of that number, but Lessard over on r/manga does a monthly breakdown of the sales, and I think their description says it better than I ever could. Quote, Ruri Dragon's debut is even bigger than most observers had predicted. Reaching nearly 120,000 sales within a single volume makes it the biggest debut since My Hero Academia. With just one volume, Ruri Dragon has become Shonen Jump's 5th best current volume seller. For Mato, the author of Ruri Dragon, things literally could not have been better. 6 years from their debut as a 17-year-old, they'd gone from publishing a relatively obscure anthology to headlining the biggest manga magazine in the industry. On top of that, they weren't just headlining, but dominating the freshman class of manga in that issue. Ruri Dragon is poised to be the next big thing. Chapters are coming out like clockwork every week, the sales continued to climb, something that is extremely vital in the manga market, and Ruri's numbers were good, very good, and kept getting better. And then, like some cruel joke, tragedy struck. First, there was a week delay on Chapter 6. Okay, no big deal. Delays happen. Just ask Cyberpunk. Bad example, but so maybe Mato is just, running behind, drinking too much of his success lately. But then, indefinite delay. Next to being outright canceled, there isn't much worse that can happen to a manga. All of the momentum that Ruri had built up, all the years that Mato had put into his one-shots, and ultimately his debut manga was now on ice. And the unfortunate thing about the entertainment industry is that the audience can be very fickle, with changing desires and preferences during any given season. There was no guarantee that Ruri would ever get another chance like this. The actual damage is in the corporate offices of these magazine companies. The publishers very rarely have patience for a mangaka who fails to deliver on time. In Ruri's case, it's a sign of the company's confidence and, to some extent, kindness, that instead of canceling Ruri, they simply set the manga on indefinite hiatus and moved it to Shonen Jump Plus, the online branch of the magazine.
No, don't do it. Fucking gonna too. Straight down the
Shonen Jump Plus.
fuck.
What happened to Mato, though? It would be a few weeks after the indefinite hiatus that everyone learned that Mato had been experiencing, quote, medical difficulties. Given the incredibly private lives that most mangaka artists lead, it's unlikely we will ever get the full story on what put Mato in the hospital, but we can make some educated guesses. On December 23rd of last year, Anime News Network writer Kim Morrissey answered a series of questions regarding the bizarrely terrible health of manga authors. Though Mato is our protagonist, quote, medical problems is a disastrously common reason for mangaka to back away from their projects. In her article, Morrissey points out a few key issues with the manga industry that drive these medical problems. Firstly, sitting for extended periods of time without sufficient movement has its own host of health concerns which apply to artists, given that artists are generally sitting for hours and hours doing, art. Morrissey also points out that despite Japan's recent reforms to overtime, this regulation does little for the manga industry where 98% of artists are self-employed. All of these pressures result in a multitude of serious medical complications that can put a mangaka out of work. Everything from carpal tunnel to lumbar compression fractures and a myriad of other posture and spinal problems. Who would have thought that living like a Falmer has consequences? It's clear from all this that artists like Mato are victims of a culture of overwork, that the insatiable volume and pace of manga and its associated industries is more than willing to sacrifice the people who create it. And I don't think it's unfair to compare the current state of mangaka to something like an NFL player. Sure, there's massive opportunity and lots of people making lots of money, but at the end of the day, the product trumps the health of the humans making it. Not only for the companies, but for the consumers as well. And the biggest benefit of manga, the self-ownership of much of the IPs by artists, is also the bane of said artists. In chasing that one breakthrough, it's not uncommon for an artist to work themselves until they physically no longer can. That self-ownership also allows the industry to operate as it always has, completely untouched by any government regulation, which unfortunately means the only real way to change this is by changing the culture of the industry itself. Today we are approaching the 6-month mark of Mato's absence. Obviously, there's no way to know how serious the problems are, or whether they're a direct byproduct of the work they put into Ruri Dragon. But with all the context we have about common practices within this industry, it's not a hard leap to take. The true brutality of Ruri Dragon's case isn't because it's so extreme, but because it's so common. For all the hopes and dreams that Mato put into Ruri, for the difficulty of the process that I've hopefully demonstrated, there are hundreds of artists, hundreds of stories and characters who simply disappear without anyone noticing. There are green shoots, though. Obviously, digital painting has lightened the physical burden for artists, but far larger than that is the undeniable change in attitudes around artists taking their time and taking breaks. Though this entire video I've discussed how an individual can drive themselves to ruin by recklessly pursuing their potential, now it's time to turn the camera back on you, the viewer. Because that drive to achieve the artist's potential, I would argue, often comes in the form of fans pushing the targets of their admiration to greater and greater exertion. We've all experienced the anticipation of a new episode of a show or volume of a manga, but very few of us have ever been on the other side of that relationship. The team, or in the case of a manga, the artist behind that work, is well aware of that anticipation. Except for them, it's multiplied by the size of their audience. And that anticipation and the scale of any criticism they can receive can drive this self-destructive cycle just as much as the internal battles of the artists themselves. I'm calling you toxic, or rather, in a position to be toxic, in the same way that two people in a dysfunctional relationship can ruin each other's lives without realizing that they are each other's problems. Without proper consideration of the audience-creator relationship, we can unintentionally drive this dysfunctional and sometimes horrific dynamic. And over the last few years, the public discussion on this dynamic has become more prominent. This is positive, and only time will tell whether this change in public opinion will stick. But regardless, for many artists, this change simply hasn't come fast enough.
The flowers disagree.